Welcome everybody to the 2022 K-State Garden Hour webinar series. We are so happy to have you all joining us today. This webinar series began back in the spring of 2020 as a hope to share extension gardening education throughout the height of the pandemic. With much success, thanks to you all, we have reached over 16,000 garden enthusiasts. This webinar is hosted by K-State Research and Extension. My name is Kelsey Hattisall, and I am the horticulture agent in River Valley District. Everybody involved in the development of this series is an extension professional for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticulture education or a related discipline, but most of all, each of us have a love for education and sharing important gardening topics. Before we get started, we do have a couple of housekeeping notes to go over. Please use the Q&A feature for questions related to the presentation. This is where we will look for questions after the presentation in the Q&A session. You will see that button along the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. Please use that again for all questions. Our moderators today are Kala and Rebecca. They will be sharing information through the chat throughout the presentation. They will also help us facilitate the Q&A questions at the end. Today's webinar will be recorded and it will be posted to our K-State Garden Hour webpage. We typically upload additional resources related to each topic, so if you have more questions, please refer to that page. Today's topic is improving soil health in the landscape and garden. I am pleased to introduce to you our speaker today, Dr. Deanne Presley, professor and extension specialist for environmental, social science, and management. That's a mouthful, Deanne. So please give us a few moments as we transition.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm a soil scientist, not social scientist exactly, but I do work with farmers a lot. In fact, I'm in a farmer's house right now who's kind enough to let me use his internet today. I am traveling with the Kansas State University soil judging team, and they're learning about soil. So in fact, if I look a little windblown, that's why, forgive me. But so anyway, I am a soil scientist and I will get my screen sharing here and take it away. So let's see. I am an avid landscape enthusiast myself, so I do a lot of landscaping around my own home, and I have a very clayey soil. So for the many of you that responded in the poll to saying that you have clayey soils, I feel you. I have very clayey soils myself. And so first I thought I'd just talk a little bit about what is a soil, why we don't like calling it dirt. And then I'll talk about some soil forming factors briefly, and soil properties, and then managing soils. Really, that's really what you want to know about, right? So how will it be useful? Well, soil is a foundation for growing all of our healthy plants. We can use alternative things, we can do hydroponics, but let's face it, most of our food and then many of our yards, we have natural soils there. And being able to understand soil properties helps us to diagnose and alleviate the physical and chemical soil problems. And then understanding how different soils affect the environment too. So soils have a huge effect on the air temperature and water quality and air quality and things like that. I won't go into that part as much today, but just know that soils and healthy soils everywhere, whether that's in agricultural environments or urban environments, are extremely important. So soils are, this is of course a long definition, but soil, I think of soil as a natural body, meaning when I think about soil, like right now, my students are out looking and digging in soil pits. We think about how it is a natural body. There's a subsurface soil and then the subsurface soil and how it changes both as we go down and across the space, across a slope or across the landscape. It's got solids and liquids and gases. It has layers. And really what we're concerned with most of the time is its ability to support rooted plants in a natural environment. So just most soils, when I think about soils, I explain that most soils are like a pie chart, right? So you've got 50% pore space and 50% mineral matter versus a rock. A rock is 100% minerals, right? So, soil, 50% is pore space and a little slice of that is organic matter. So in a prairie soil, we might have 10% organic matter, but in many of our managed systems, we might be down to half of what we started with oftentimes. So we can amend that to improve that. Organic matter would consist of roots and microbes and animals, and as they decompose each other, then we end up with humus, the dark soil, what gives soils a dark color. And so in this pore space area, usually we don't want to see a saturated soil. Saturated soils mean that, of course, roots are going to suffer, but also the things that live in soil, the microbes that do a lot of nutrient cycling, they suffer as well. So a lot of times, maybe 50% pore space filled with water is a desirable thing. So compaction, of course, is when we squish out a lot of this pore space and end up with most of this pie wedge being mineral matter. So if we were going to build a pond, we would want to compact the soil, but other times we would like to not compact the soil. So minimizing traffic, especially minimizing really, really heavy traffic, is really, really important for most soils. So soils have layers. That's like a Shrek thing. Ogres have layers, soils have layers. We have topsoil and we have a subsoil. And then down, we call the bottom of a profile is called parent material. And that's sort of where the material came from. So for example, my students right now are on top of a sand dune. And so the wind blew that sand in, and then over time plants grow and their decomposition of the roots darkens the topsoil. A lot of times the subsoil could be any color. Well, if it's orange like this, that means it's well drained. If it's gray, that's probably an indication of poor drainage. And drainage is, of course, something we can control also to make a soil better. So I've just thrown in here a soil map for Kansas, and I know not everyone here is from Kansas, but similar general soil maps exist for all of the United States and many other places in the world. And what I want to point out is that soils differ. So this is Northeast Kansas. We've got soils that have a lot of glacial materials in them. We can go here to the soils along the Arkansas River that are going to be, generally speaking, a lot sandier, but also they vary a lot. You can just go across a field or across a landscape and see big differences. So that's what I'd like to just say, is that soils differ. Soils differ even across a short distance, like maybe across your yard. So just understanding that they differ and that not all soils are going to need the exact same things to make them highly productive. But there are places you can learn about soils too. I'll talk about that later. So soil color, mentioned that a little bit already. This is actually a soil from North Carolina. So there's a thin dark horizon. You can see the leaves there, and then it gets into this gray layer. And then down below it's orange and gray colored. And so that's just another example that soils have layers, and they kind of recur in repeatable patterns. But as a soil scientist, what I look for is dark. Black means high organic matter. Red colors mean plenty of oxygen is getting into that soil. So just like I didn't get that. Oops, sorry, that's my watch. So just like anything containing iron is going to rust if it's out in the weather, gets oxygen, gets rain, it'll rust. Soil minerals rust as well. And so that's what gives us the orange color. And so that's an indication of good drainage. Gray colors are an indication of not enough drainage, because those iron minerals then start to look gray in the absence of oxygen. Now, I will point out, of course, that limestone and shale derived soils can look kind of gray too. So it doesn't mean everything. You still have to look at the soil and feel it and make some interpretations. But these are some of the things we look for. So if you are digging and you see a lot of water and you see gray colors, that's an indication of a drainage issue. And so the other thing I'll point out, these are some cores that I pulled a long time ago now, but I still like the picture. These were taken under the exact same lighting in my lab by my student. And so these are from a grassland soil, and the ones on the left are so the ones on the right are from a grassland soil. The ones from the left are right across the field from a cultivated field. So the point is that we've used our soils and we've changed our soils, and that we could try to make a soil better. And one quickie thing I'll say is that organic matter in the form of compost, manure, or biochar, or growing cover crops to replenish this is always a good thing. Organic matter is almost always our answer for many, many, many problems to make a soil better. So texture, and there's a texture by field link you'll be seeing here in a moment. Texture is the percent sand, silt, and clay. So when we do this, we're ignoring that mineral amount and we're thinking how much percent sand, what percent silt, and what percent clay is in our soil. We call this an inherent property. In an agricultural field, we're not going to change this, but in a landscape or in a garden, you actually could, because if you're, depending on the size, but you could change this. If you had poor texture, you maybe could. Is it going to be expensive? Of course. So usually we just modify the texture by bringing in organic matter, because organic matter will always make every soil feel looser and have better drainage. But so sand, salt, and clay, if you don't know what you have, you can do this texture by feel. So this person's hand is sort of crumbling up a chunk of soil, adding water, and making like a Play-Doh consistency to try to make a ribbon. The ribbon length, the longer it is, the more clay it contains. And then sometimes I make a little swimming pool or bathtub off of a piece of that in my hand with a bunch of water and feel it to feel how much sand is in there. And you can estimate that pretty well. You get pretty good over time. And really what we're trying to do is get into one of these boxes on the textural triangle to understand, do I have a silt loam? Those feel really smooth, really soft, make a little bit of a ribbon, but not a huge one. Or do I have something over here, a sand, pure sand almost, with very few fines? So here's again another person, former student doing that. And we do that by making a ribbon. We can get plus or minus 5% like that. And there's other things you can do too. So for example, this is a jar, like a jar method. So take like a mason jar and add a certain amount of soil. So add 25 grams of soil or a quarter cup of soil or something like that, and shake it up. And you can see that the way it settles, the larger particles, sand particles, settle out first. And so the thicker that layer of sand is versus the second thing to settle out was the silts. And the very last thing, and it might even take a week for these to settle out, would be the clays. So you can't keep bumping the jars, but you can see these relative proportions if you want to compare two different types of soils to see what you have. So water holding capacity is greatly affected by your texture, as you can see. So we inherently know that if we pour water through a sandy soil, it goes through quickly, but also how much water is going to be there for a plant to use long-term depends on this texture as well. So clayey soils hold a lot of water, but they hold on to that water too tightly where a plant root can't take it. So silt loams are, kind of probably every soil scientist's favorite texture because it's very useful for growing plants. And so I'm not going to answer how much water plants use in a day because that depends on the plant, depends if it's indoors, outdoors, in the wind, whatever, but they do use a considerable amount of water. And so for any of these textures, adding organic matter will make this number larger. That organic matter is almost like a gazillion tiny little sponges because they can hold water, and organic matter adds elasticity to a soil. So a soil is less compactable when it contains organic matter. So structure is when we take those sand, silt, and clay particles together with the organic matter. And I think of it, I have a little mortar and brick diagram here because I think of it how you arrange that into units. And so, for example, this is a soil that you can just imagine if you were a raindrop navigating your way down through this, you can navigate in pretty well. So this soil has really, really strong structure. And so strong structure means that it's aggregated well, the particles hold together well. And that means there's more space between the PEDs. PEDs are chunks of soil. It means that water will move at a better rate in the soils with moderate and strong structure. And tillage destroys soil structure. So we know that, of course, maybe many people are about to think about tilling up a garden now, or perhaps that's something you'll wait for spring to do. But tillage does destroy soil structure. So by breaking up all those PEDs, I know you want to break up a really chunky, hard soil. But when you do that, it actually, I think of it like this. Imagine you took like a big fountain glass pop, fountain pop glass, right? A big 32-ounce plastic glass, and you filled it up with popcorn. And then you smash that popcorn down with your hand, or just pound on it, maybe with a kitchen tool or something, just pound on it and break up those pieces. It'll eventually occupy less space. But then what if you could fluff it back up again? Over time, it'd be like, if you just kept doing that, packing that down, you really destroy the soil structure. And that's when you get crusting. That's when you get, raindrops come and they crust over that soil. So the less tillage you can do, the better from a soil, from a drainage, from an infiltration standpoint. So plant roots and microbes and amendments such as manure and compost build soil structure back. So microbes do this by taking those sand, silt, and clay particles and binding them together like fungal hyphae as they digest plant roots and plant, straw and things like that. They build aggregation back. So that's how you get back to a soil that looked like the one I showed before. Everybody's dug in sod before and thought, oh, this is really tough to dig, or laid sod, and you can just pick it up by the grass, right? But that's that structure that's written, those roots that are really building that and holding it and making it so that water can move, and gases too. So this is a picture from an agricultural field showing how compaction does ruin soil structure. So we don't have those crumbs anymore. Now we've kind of just got a chunk of soil, a massive layer, and you can see there's below where the arrow is, you can see kind of a line, a pan, if you will. And that means that a lot of the soil will be just not accessed by roots. And, when I talk to little kids about soil, I'd say, when you need a drink, you go turn on the faucet, or you go get something out of the refrigerator. And that's where the only place plants are going to get that, right? They're only going to get it out of their soil. So the roots have to be able to access that, or it's, game over and they'll be droughty or whatever. So let's talk about chemical properties. And so I haven't said this yet, but there are three things that go into soil health: physical, chemical, and biological. So, and I always think about organic matter. If those are like the legs of a stool, organic matter is kind of like the seat. The organic matter holds those things all together. And the more organic matter is, those three pillars kind of all work better. But if you take away one of those pillars, like say we take a great soil and we compact it, we're messing up the physical properties, the stool doesn't work anymore, right? If we took that same soil and had really, really poor fertility, that soil wouldn't produce very well. So we need all of those things to work together to have a healthy soil: chemical, physical, biological. So let's talk about chemical for a little while. Of course, pH. Different soils have different pHs. If any of you live in a desert area, your soils tend to be rather alkaline because the salts that are part of, so carbonates and sulfates and things like that make soils more basic. And the more rainfall you get, the more acidic your soil will just be naturally from leaching out all these salts. And so in an agricultural, or a lot of times in a gardening situation as well, we'll want a pH 6.5 is just right. So at 6.5, we say it's just right because almost all of these elements, the macronutrients, and then many of our secondary and micronutrients are most available. At 6.5 is where the majority of these are at a nice wide spot, or a feasibly wide spot, right? So 6.5 is good, 6 to 7.5 is good. And for certain plants, of course, we're going to try to manage over here. So if we are trying to grow blueberries or something else that loves acidic soils, then we have to make sure we're making our soil pH do what we want. So at low pHs, we like a lot of iron, or there's different elements that, like aluminum, will bind up phosphorus at low pH. And at a high pH, calcium will bind with phosphorus. So that's why phosphorus particularly is when 6.5 is its happiest spot. So depending on what you want to grow, you'll need your pH at different levels. And I've just thrown up a few examples. Blueberry, of course, is sort of the one I always think of as acid, the most acid loving pH. And we can adjust pH. So organic matter is here, just talking about how most soils have 2 to 4% in most soils. So clay and organic matter store nutrients for plants to use later on. So if you think about clay as having generally a negative charge, and organic matter too has a lot of negative charges on it. So places where there's unsatisfied negative charges, those both tend to hold onto those positive things. So calcium is positive 2+, so it's attracted. Magnesium, potassium, ammonium, the molecule ammonium has positive 1 charge. So they're all held temporarily. I think of that kind of like a refrigerator. It holds food temporarily till you want to use it. And so that's why more organic matter is good. And some people say, wait, clay. Well, this is where I say soil, the best soils are kind of like Goldilocks soils. They have some silt, some sand, and some clay. We don't want too much clay. We don't want too much sand, but some of each of those makes for a really great soil. That's what we call a loam when it's got some of each. So these can be easily displaced and exchanged by plant uptakes, and then negative ions remain in soil solution. So nitrate, chlorine, sulfate, those will stay in the soil solution floating around unless we get a bunch of rain and that can leach it out. But otherwise they'll stay in the soil solution accessible for plants. So I think, again, this is just a little piece of a soil, but just imagining how it's just covered in negative charges and then it holds on to these positively charged cations. So we know that inadequate nutrient supply leads to deficiency symptoms, and that's basically a plant illness. And each one will be expressed differently. So if you have questions about, okay, what is going on with my plants? Of course, I hope you contact your master gardeners or your extension agent in your county or your extension educators to say, hey, what am I seeing here? Is this a nutrient deficiency? Is this a pest? What's going on? But they each express just a little bit differently in each crop. And if it's significant, then a deficiency ultimately could lead to plant death. But here's something I wanted to point out is, okay, you could actually have plenty of phosphorus in a soil and have a phosphorus deficiency show up. And you're thinking, how can that be? Well, if your soil is compacted and the roots can't get to where the phosphorus is, then it acts like a deficiency. It just can't get to it. So that again comes back to, we have to have good physical properties go along with our chemical properties for everything to work out right. Let's talk about managing soils. So knowing something about your soil and your site is very, very helpful. We can test for plant available nutrients. We can fertilize, we can add organic matter, we can compost and add compost to our system. So I want to tell you about Google Earth, so Web Soil Survey. It works a lot like Google Earth or Google Maps, where you can just put in your location or even zoom to your location and look up the soils that are on your land. It's pretty general for a lot of projects, such as if I was going to dig a house with a basement or put in a new septic system. It's too general for that. Those need, we need to be sure we're right, but it gives you a good idea for your property. So what are this? Soils have series. So the soil series for the state of Kansas is called Harney, and in Iowa it's called Tama. So just like if you like trivia like that, just like your state bird, you can look up your state soil. But you can read about that. You can see what kinds of soil depths do I have? What are the soil properties? What are the textures? What are the general ranges of pHs I might find? It's a nice starting point, I find. So it's called Web Soil Survey. Honestly, I just usually Google it when I want to find Web Soil Survey, and the big green button here says start it. And then from there, you navigate much like you would in Google Maps. So you can locate by an address or a GPS location or whatever. And you can navigate through there to learn more about your soils. So let's talk about soil testing, collecting a soil sample, for example. So if this was a hypothetical property, how I might lay this out. So I saw in the beginning video, I saw an extension agent giving a soil probe to a client, and those are definitely a good thing to do, get a soil probe. You can sample with a spade. So sometimes I'll do that if I don't tell anyone, if I forget my soil probe as a soil scientist, but if I forget and I have a spade, I can take a shovel and just not take that whole sample, but take like a little slice out of that shovel and then put that in my bucket. So you can see the footprints here saying, okay, collect this soil sample, then walk a couple spaces, collect another core, another core. And we're going to put all of those into the same bucket. Usually we sample 0 to 6 inches. Most of our plant recommendations are saying, okay, let's base it off of the 0 to 6 inches. Roots go much deeper than that and to get water and to maybe go access other things that they need. But the way we do our recommendations is based on what's in that upper 6 inches, because it's so important for a seedling. And to be honest, a lot of roots are using nutrients out of that level. So you do sort of a zigzag pattern, maybe walking away from the compost, not trying to sample right underneath the bird feeder. Bird droppings could have a lot of nutrients in them. So we don't want to skew our sample by collecting there either. So just walking across like normal areas. And if you wanted, you could get a separate sample of your flower bed. So if this is the one for your turf and this is one for your flowers. So just thinking about that you want to collect a representative sample, try to make it as representative as possible. So put 15 or 20 or 30 cores into one bag or one bucket, break it up by hand, and then pour some into a bag and take it to wherever you want to get your soil tested. Your local extension office is a great place to begin. There are many commercial labs, but I think working with your extension agent is a great way to get going with like, well, what test should I do? There's a lot of different options. They can help guide you with choices to make. So shovel's okay, probe's better. Probe's better just because you get it. You don't have to work with such a massive sample. If you're taking samples with a spade, your sample could get massive. So this probe just works really well, but I wouldn't go buy one. I would just borrow one from an extension agent. They all have them in their offices. So when do you sample? Well, for something like an annual garden or new turf going in, fall is great, or spring before you do tillage is great too. Perennials or established turf, you could do this sampling at any time to find out where your nutrient levels are. Or if you had suspected salt damage, so that's something I didn't mention at the beginning, but salts, salinity can be a big soil problem as well. So if you don't get enough water to leach those salts through the profile, it's just kind of like if you have too much, if you intake too much salt, you could feel parched, you could feel thirsty. Same thing. It's that osmotic tension that the salts exert so that the plants could have water, but not really access the water. So, and you can sample each area separately. Like, again, like I said, so maybe a flower bed would be separate of a vegetable garden. They may need different things. And repeating that over time, every 2 to 3 years, if you were to be harvesting a lot of, let's say, sweet corn off of a field, you would need to eventually replenish those nutrients. And so sampling helps you know what's there and what's possible. So there's so many different tests you could do. The routine things that we do, though, are pH, because again, that effect tells us what's available, how the nutrients are available. Buffer pH tells how it's a measure of, it helps with understanding, again, sort of nutrient availability. And organic matter, that's just important because again, the more I kind of like to joke that like organic matter is kind of like being too rich or too beautiful. You know, we joke that can't have too much money or be too beautiful, right? Well, organic matter is kind of like that too. Organic matter is good. A lot of organic matter helps with many, many soil properties. I suppose you could overdo it technically, but more organic matter is better. Up to 10% is a great amount. And available phosphorus and potassium. Other things, of course, would be calcium, magnesium, sulfur, zinc, boron, and manganese. Soils need those. We don't really need to sample for some elements like iron. Iron's in every soil. We don't need to know. Some of these other micronutrients probably don't need to know unless there was really some deficiency showing up that was strange. And why do I say not to worry about sampling for nitrogen? Well, now you could sample for available nitrogen, but the thing about nitrogen is it changes over time, it changes rapidly. So if you're going to sample for nitrogen because you want to know how much nitrogen do I need to apply on this crop, that's one of those things you do right beforehand. You can't sample nitrogen and then wait 6 months and assume that whatever nitrogen was in your soil will still be there 6 months later. Doesn't work like that because nitrogen can leave the soil by leaching down. If it's a little bit wet for a while, we could have denitrification and lose it to the atmosphere. So it's really temporary, kind of like produce in your refrigerator. It's temporary. We don't have it there forever versus some of these other things would be more like canned goods, right? They last a long time. And there's other things you can do. So texture, we can do that. We can analyze that in a lab, but we also, it's not always routine, but if you really had some questions like what is my texture and you weren't comfortable with texture by feel, you can do that in a lab. Soluble salts, it's not something we always test for, but that is okay. If we're trying to figure out why is something happening with this soil, sometimes the salts can be an issue. So maybe you're trying to understand, well, the soils near my sidewalk are acting weird. Is this, or the plants near my sidewalk are acting weird? Did I overdo it with the salt or did somebody apply a lot of, salt on the ice or whatever? So it can be helpful. And then like lead and arsenic, those are ones that can be problematic in certain situations. So, again, it's not something we're always going to test for, and it doesn't mean they're always a huge problem, but if you think it's a problem, you can test for it. So urban soils are where we maybe potentially worry about some of these things. Arsenic from treated lumber, lead from a lot of different things. Lead paint, leaded gasoline would be the two main ones where you can sometimes see some issues. So urban soils, this is just an example. And we do have a lead handout, so that link should be coming up soon for managing urban soils and testing soils and knowing when to test and knowing what it means. And here's our soil sample information sheet for our Kansas State University testing lab. Again, many other states have these testing labs as well. Commercial labs would have these forms online as well. You can get these from your local county extension office or your agent. And they can, again, help you with choosing the exact right testing package for the issue. So you can see environmental here, if that was really a concern. Otherwise, you might just be more interested in package 1 or potentially packages 1 and 2. So let's talk about modifying a soil. So pH, we talked about, okay, 6.5 is great. If we are below 6.5 and we want to increase to 6.5, then we would add lime. So lime, calcium carbonate, usually mined from a limestone mine. So finer the better. There's actually something called effective calcium carbonate equivalent. So that's a way we can compare different limestones and see if this is a good kind of limestone or not. So if you're buying it from a garden store or from some other kind of supplier, they've probably already done that math to find out that this is good calcium carbonate for this purpose. And that's good to till into the soil. It's not particularly mobile. So if you're going to do this, this might be a good time of year. Apply it now, let it lay there, potentially till it in the spring. It's not going to go anywhere. So that would work. If you need to decrease your soil pH, so in a more arid state like Kansas, especially on the farther west side of our state, decreasing pH might be something that you're considering, especially if you were wanting to grow certain crops or wanting to have certain colors of hydrangeas. I believe they need acid soils to express their color differently. So you can do that. And so elemental sulfur is one thing that does take time. It is a fairly slow process. So it's not like you're going to immediately adjust your pH, because that sulfur goes into the soil and then microbes have to interact with that sulfur to then decrease the pH over time. So this could take a year or several months. So don't think you're going to get immediate a reaction from that. Aluminum sulfate is another one. I think there's also iron sulfate that works the same way. But this is, again, where your local extension agent, especially those very excellent horticultural agents we have, can help with this math. Because if you're just wanting to adjust the pH for just a couple hydrangeas or a few blueberry bushes, this isn't probably going to be a huge amount that you need to add, but it'll be a large amount in one spot. So they can definitely help you with that math, help you figure out the timing to do this. So these are definitely possibilities. But I would say, working with a very local person can help you make the best decisions possible. One thing I don't have anywhere in here is gypsum on my slides, but I wanted to bring that up. I get asked about gypsum a lot. So we use gypsum. So gypsum is calcium sulfate. Calcium sulfate. And when you think sulfate, you think sulfuric acid, right? Maybe that's the first thing that pops into your head. But actually, calcium sulfate is a neutral salt. So it detaches into, or it dissolves into calcium and sulfate. So sometimes gypsum is applied just because it's a great calcium source. There are a few crops that use a lot of calcium, like peanuts are a crop that uses a lot of calcium. But most of the time we use calcium sulfate, gypsum, to kick sodium out of our system. So if you happen to have a lot of sodium in your soil, you know how, like, if I have too much sodium, maybe I can't get my ring off because I start to swell. I get, swollen, my fingers swell. Soils do the exact same thing. So clay particles, when you add a bunch of sodium, and you might be thinking salting the earth, sounds familiar, right? Salting the earth is a bad thing. So when you get too much sodium in a soil, the clay particles swell up. And when they swell up, they have nowhere to go except to crash into each other, and they squeeze the pore space out. And so if you add sodium, in fact, I did this one time for an extension lesson to show people, I overdid it. and I added a lot of sodium, and that soil swelled over like pavement. So the first time we got rain, it just puddled up. And then every time we get rain after that, it would run off. So really, this is something, if you want to destroy soil structure, in fact, if you want to seal a pond, you can use sodium for that. It helps soil, clay particles just repel each other. So that's when we need sulfur, or sorry, that's when we need gypsum, is when we have a soil problem specifically related to sodium. So sometimes people say, oh, should I add gypsum to help my soil drain better? And I say, well, how much sodium do you have in your soil? And they're like, I don't know. Well, then you need to get a test. We should test it. And because if you think, man, my soil just drains terrible. Well, mine does too. In my house, my soil drains terrible, but it's not because it's high in sodium. It's because it's just high in clay, and my clay is loaded with calcium. So adding more calcium is not going to make it any better. So that's where we go to my friend compost. Compost helps a lot. But so again, before buying a bunch of amendments, just figuring out, does your soil need it, is the best. That's the best thing to do. So again, here's a table talking about, how much we would add. This is out of the Kansas Garden Guide. Stole it right out of there. So we can see, it talks about for, a certain square footage area, how many pounds we'd need for a sandy soil versus how much for a loamy soil versus how much for a clayey soil. So that's the other thing. We're going to talk about texture by feel. If you're like, well, I don't know what my texture is, how much do I add? Well, it's a pretty big difference, right? Twice as much for a clayey soil. So that's why we do need to know something about the texture to help make the best decisions possible. And again, for sulfur to lower pH, it depends on your texture. So, and it says add all these materials to soil, incorporate to a depth of 6 inches with tillage when no crops are growing. So again, when I talked about tillage before as being bad, I just mean over tillage. If you need to do tillage to get a plant into the ground or get a seed into the ground, that's one thing. But in fact, I'll never forget when I was a child, my parents had a giant garden. All we did was pick things and weed and can. And I just remember one day I was a kid and I was out just raking a spot just to get it, just so it was powder, and my parents were like, actually, that's not good because your soil can't breathe. If you seal off all those pores, your soil can't breathe. You need gases to get out of the soil. You need water to get into the soil. Plus, it can erode more when you have it so level and flat. And I was like, oh, okay. So that was my first erosion lesson. It's probably like, I don't know, 7 or 8. My parents saying, we don't need to do that. So when I talk about tillage, I mean like overdoing it with tillage. That's where it becomes a problem. So fertilizer, synthetic, I say non-synthetic, because at first I had organic on here and I was like, well, that's not really what I mean. Organic production has a very specific meaning. What I mean is things that come from natural processes. So like byproducts or manure. So I'm gonna move on from this. So fertilizers, every fertilizer is going to have a different analysis. So you need to know what you want to use and how much you need. Really, first it's how much do you need to then figure out how much you're going to use. So let's talk about problem soils. So heavy soils. Heavy soils are clayey soils. That's where the aggregates get really tightly packed and you have a lot of pores, but they're very small. You can get poor drainage. Roots can suffocate. It gets cloddy if you till it when wet. It gets really cloddy and hard if you drive over it when it's wet. So we can improve that with organic residues, get better structure, and get larger pores. What about light soils? So like really, really sandy soils, then we end up with, we have large pore spaces, but we know they have a lot of porosity, but they get droughty. And again, we can improve that by adding organic matter, whether that's compost, manure, biochar. I know biochar is very, very popular. I know less about biochar than I know about compost and manure in terms of its utility, but definitely on a sandier soil, a lighter textured soil, that's where these become probably more important. So basically, when in doubt, adding organic matter is a good thing. We can improve water and nutrient holding capacity, microbial activity. That's always happening in the background. And I always think about, food web. Think about every food web you've ever seen where there's a polar bear that eats all the things that eat all the things, right? Same thing's happening in soil. Earthworms, those are the big ones we get excited when we see because we know they do great things, but there's a whole big pyramid beneath that of like tiny things, microbes, like microscopic things we cannot see. You might think, oh, pests are bad. Oh no, that's just when you have an unbalanced food web. If you have a fairly balanced food web, then you got things eating each other, and pests have a harder time getting out of whack, out of proportion. So a pest is usually just a sign of too much sameness, right? Too much same kind of plants or sameness happening when a pest starts to come in and take over. Organic matter, we can have less needs for pesticide, and we can also have less pesticide and nutrient leaching out of a profile when we have organic matter to hold on to it with all the charges that it has. Organic matter itself provides nutrients. So as soils mineralize, I forgot to fertilize a corn crop this year. It was kind of like a bunch of people involved, but we all forgot to do something. And our corn yielded 16 bushels per acre, which is bad. 10 times that was like the goal, but it was a drought. But the reason it was able to grow and have an ear of corn to begin with is because that organic matter was mineralizing. It releases some nitrogen and some sulfur. And then, so it was using what was left over, but also using this nitrogen. So, if you think, what did people do before fertilizer? Well, our soils used to have more organic matter and they used to supply more nitrogen, and they were probably just less productive. That's a tangent. Organic matter can help suppress some diseases. So we can add it through these different things. Compost, biochar has said question marks. Like I said, I know less about that. Manure, yes. Can you overdo it with manure and compost? Because there's probably some extension agents sitting here going, oh, but too much compost can be a problem. It can be. You could overdo it with with compost or manure, because those should be added to a soil and mixed in a certain amount, right? Like a quarter to a third of the volume. So think about a pot or a 5-gallon bucket. If you're going to do something, a third to a quarter compost or manure is good, and then the rest soil. That's the right ratios. If we overdo it with trying to grow something in pure compost or apply way too much manure and just push it up around a crop, it can be too much of a good thing in one spot, because manure and compost can be a little bit high in salts. So just not too much in one spot. So I want to talk about cover crops. Cover crops, this is one of the things I do a lot with. We have cover crops to build soils back, especially in an agricultural system. So we want to improve organic matter, improve soil structure, because these things take time. We can, by having better organic matter, we have better infiltration. We can reduce evaporation. We can reduce erosion. I said agricultural setting. These things are all true in a non-ag setting too, in a garden, a landscape, yes. Nitrogen fixation. Many people do this. They grow a legume cover crop and then plow it under. That's called a green manure. And that's another way we used to grow crops before we had, fertilizers. Biological activity. Yes. So we can have a good diverse food web. So the good microbes can beat up the bad microbes. Nutrient availability. I haven't talked about this, but many microbes actually form association with plant roots, and they go get nutrients that the plant can't get itself. That's how big blue stem functions. It goes and microbes go and get the phosphorus and bring it to big blue stem. And then some environmental things too. If we've got a green growing living cover crop, it holds on to soils and nutrients, and then they don't end up in other places where we don't want them, like a pond or a stream. So weeds, yes, if we grow our cover crops heavy enough, so if you have good cereal rye before pumpkins and melons and all the things are very, very good. Cover crop support, like baby chicks for pheasants and turkeys and things like that, because if you have a cover crop and you've got some bugs that are attracted, living there, the chicks eat the bugs, the chicks then get big enough. And if the chick can survive being a chick, it can grow into wildlife. Adulthood and help with wildlife issues. Insects, attracting beneficial insects in that then can eat the bad bugs. That's still something that our entomologists are thinking about deeply, right? And working on and figuring out how can we make this work. So selecting a cover crop, if you're sitting there thinking, how do I figure out what cover crop? There is a great tool that a bunch of different states contribute to, but midwestcovercrops.org has a website. There's a selector tool button here. And in the selector tool button, right now they're working on the vegetable tool, but there is another tool that's for row crops. So I would just, if you're thinking about, well, what could I grow in the wintertime? You could just go through that tool and just explore. Right now there's 40, and we're actually working on it. And I think we're gonna end up with 44 different cover crops. So there's also a book that you can get. So you could ask your extension agent, hey, can I get the book she's talking about? There's a pocket guide book that we distribute that's great, and it's got information on each one of these. So hairy vetch is a great nitrogen fixer. Ryegrass is another good one. Winter rye is a classic one for right now. You could go out and plant winter rye right now and then let that grow over the winter time. It looks a lot like wheat, acts a lot like wheat. So you grow it, wintertime, it doesn't do much. And then the spring, it'll start to grow more. And when you decide, now is when I want to kill it, you can just kill it. So my grad student has a large garden, and he was telling me that I think he said he took like a big piece of lumber and just tied a rope around it and drug it across. And then he's using that as a mat, a light colored mat, which is nice for when you're out there working in the summer sun to have a light colored surface. It reflects the sun and you just stay cooler working on top of winter rye. And so this is a slide from just talking about the fact that we did not have a yield penalty from growing cover crops in general before pumpkins. So I say amend over a site, don't amend just a hole. Otherwise you might have roots just kind of grow in a circle, and we don't want that. So again, your extension agents can help a lot with, making these decisions or saying, hey, remember these things. But and excess water, we want excess water to be able to drain away. So there's my contact info. I don't know where this 45 minutes just went, but let's spend the rest of the time with your questions. What questions do you have?
Okay, so we've got we've had a good number of questions. So some of the biggest themes that we've had in the questions is kind of about how do we amend our soils, like with compost and amendments, when do we till amendments in versus when do we apply them to the surface of the soil? When is it good to till, when is it good to not till, and things like that. So maybe hit some kind of big picture questions on that.
Yeah, so I was just seeing if I had that in an organized spot in one place. And here, how about I just stop sharing in general? Let's see, I'm going to stop share. There we go. So what I would say is, so I love right now for, oh, thank you for that. Somebody posted to check out the garden guide on adding compost. Yes, that is an excellent resource. I like now for compost, and I'll tell you why. So let's say that you have a pretty poor soil like I do. I have a lot of clay. Right now, if I want to go compost, I could add couple 3 inches of compost right now across my entire span of my garden and let that sit there all winter long. And then the rain will come, the snow will come, things like that. And if there are some high salts in that, I don't care, because it's going to leach those out over the winter time. And then I come in the spring and I till those in. That's a great recipe right there. That's the perfect way to do it. So that can work for lime, elemental sulfur. That one's a little trickier, but the sooner you want to see a pH change, you'd want to get that going. So I would say that's my way I do it. 1.5 to 2 inches applied over my whole area. So I have some new landscaping beds that I'm going to put in my terrible clayey soil. So I'm going to do this right now. I'm going to get compost, put it across 1.5 to 2 inches deep, and I can let it lay there, let the salts rain out of it, leach out of it all winter long, and then till it in the spring in a dry period. Because I don't want to do tillage when it's too wet. Otherwise, I'll get compaction, and I don't want that. So that's how I do it. Now you're probably thinking, what if it gets really windy and blows the compost away? Well, it's not that big a deal, because it's just going to blow it into my yard or some other place where it could be beneficial too. But if you were really concerned about that, I guess you could do tillage now. It wouldn't hurt anything to do that tillage now if it's dry and dry conditions to keep it from blowing away. That won't hurt a thing. Salts would still leach out. Now, Rebecca, I know you know just about as much about this as I do. So if I'm saying something you want to correct, you go for it.
A lot of the questions I've responded to in the chat, I think the biggest thing every time I talk to someone about amending their soil is it's not like there's a right or wrong answer when you're dealing with your soil. You have to figure out what you're really trying to solve. If you're really compacted, you may not want to be tilling more, but if you've got a horrible phosphorus deficiency, you may want to till to get that phosphorus deeper in the soil, or if you have a terribly high pH, you may want to till to get that sulfur deeper into the soil. So like, I feel like with soil, you have to really think through all the pros and cons every single time rather than just doing the same thing every time. That's been my experience.
Yeah, and there's no absolutes, like you just said. So yeah.
Well, don't add lime if you have a high pH. That I think is.
Oh, that's a good absolute. Yep.
Yeah.
Don't add lime if you have high pH. And I would say don't add anything without really knowing if you should or not, like, yeah, I wouldn't anyway.
Yeah. So kind of along that line, we had a question, which I thought was a really good question about if you're adding, a bunch of decomposed leaves, so leaf mold, then how should that impact your nitrogen fertilization that year?
That is a good question. So if it's decomposed, so leaves, I'll start with grass. Grass clippings contain a lot of nitrogen. So if somebody is adding grass, I just drove past, I saw somebody had just added a very thick layer of grass clippings across a garden the other day. I thought that's a lot of nitrogen. So maybe they're probably meeting a lot of their nitrogen need from those grass clippings. But with leaves don't contain near as much nitrogen as like grass clippings do. So I'm not sure how much of their nitrogen. I can tell you this though. If you know something about your organic matter, so let's say that you've got 1% organic matter in your soil. The way we as K-State Soil Testing Lab would say, for every 1% soil organic matter you have, that will supply 20 pounds of nitrogen for a summer crop, like corn, any of the summer crops, right? Any sweet corn, tomatoes, whatever, that'll apply 1 pound. So if you have 5%, that's going to supply 100 pounds of nitrogen, which is a lot. That might be all your plant crop needs, and maybe you don't need to supply any nitrogen. So I think leaf mulch, you're building up your organic matter. That could, over time, start to satisfy almost all of your nitrogen requirement if it gets high enough. But that's again where so hard to answer until if I knew if you start with 1% or if you're already at 10% organic matter, you're like, well, you could probably stop. That's a lot. And then I do know this. One year I personally grew some fine looking tomato trees. I called them tomato redwoods. They just had big old stems on them. And I was like, what am I doing wrong? I had no tomatoes. All I had was tomato trees, no tomatoes. And then a very knowledgeable master gardener said, well, you have way too much nitrogen in your soil. So you can actually have too much of some things for certain crops at certain times. And so very vital to learn that.
Okay. So we also had several questions about soil conditioners.
Yes.
And those sorts of products. So if you wanted to comment on those types of products.
Yeah, so many soil conditioners just they speed up processes. So for example, so a soil conditioner, usually what a soil conditioner is something that I think of it kind of like a sticky glue. So soil conditioners, their goal is usually to take soils and stick them together. So especially the clay particles, flocculate those together so that you would rapidly end up with more pore space, just like you would if you added compost, or just like if the food web and the mycorrhizal fungi bond those things together as well. Bind soil particles together as well to make pore space. So soil conditioner, people sell them because people buy them and they stick particles together. So I don't really think there's anything magical about them. It's just that they speed it up. And again, people buy them because people sell them. And I have never recommended one because I've never seen a need for one. And I'm probably made somebody that might sell those mad, but that's just how I feel about them.
Okay. So I have a question in the chat saying that they've got some buckwheat seed to use as a cover crop, and curious about when to plant it and how to use it in a garden setting. Yeah,
so buckwheat is a summer crop. So that's a good one for maybe you have some early potatoes you take off or something early, some of the cold crops. So broccoli, some of those things that are really, really early crops. and then plant buckwheat, and because buckwheat does its thing in 90 days. So start to finish 90 days. So June 1st to September 1st, it'd be done. And so it likes heat, it likes summer. So that's when I would do buckwheat. Buckwheat is a very good soil, very good cover crop. And buckwheat is known to solubilize soil phosphorus. It does it for itself. And it'll leave behind a little bit of phosphorus that's available too for future plants. So it's not like a miracle crop, but I mean, it is kind of an interesting crop in that way. And it flowers and brings in a lot of those beneficial insects too. So parasitic wasps, so things that kill other things. So it's a good thing.
Yeah, I like buckwheat for a home gardener because it breaks down really easily. You know, even if you don't have like fancy equipment or things like that, it breaks down pretty well. So,
Yeah.
Recommendations on adding compost to an established garden without disturbing roots.
Yeah, without disturbing roots. I would just be, you could probably just add it, this time of year. So 1.5 inches, maybe not so deep, but to an established garden, you could probably just add it to the surface and never work it in, and that would be fine. Or just work it in, like for example, the other day I taught a compost class and I ended up with about 6 5-gallon buckets. And I just went out after the class was over and put, I had a little scoop and I just put it around a whole bunch of landscaping plants around the building that I was in. I just took it around and I didn't incorporate it at all because they were landscape plants. They were, woody landscape plants. So, or like, some of them were, I guess, forbs, like black-eyed Susans and things like that. But I just took a little bit and went around each plant, and pretty soon my 6 5-gallon buckets were gone. So it can be surface applied too. It'll work its way down. Microbes or insects will, earthworms will come up and get it and work up and down. It'll become incorporated.
Okay, I think that's most of the questions that we've had come in, so that we haven't answered in the Q&A already. So if you asked a question and you didn't see the answer, be sure to check in the Q&A as well.
All righty, then we'll wrap this up for today. Thank you very much, Deanne, for that wonderful presentation. Thank you all once again for joining us for the K-State Garden Hour series hosted by K-State Research and Extension. We were glad to have you here today to learn all that wonderful information about improving your soil health in the landscape and gardens. Please join us next month for wildlife damage prevention and control in the lawn and garden. Once again, this session was recorded and will be posted on the website by tomorrow afternoon. After this webinar ends today, you will receive a prompt to take an evaluation survey. Please fill this out as we greatly appreciate your feedback. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at gardenhour@ksu.edu. Once again, thank you for joining us, and I hope you can have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday and a good rest of your week.